I'll get somebody contacting me saying, well, my doctor did my nutrient levels and they're all normal. So they've told me it would be a waste of my time to try the micronutrients. What do I think? And I would say, well, actually, the majority of people who we test in our research studies are normal in their nutrient levels. And yet we show they benefit from the nutrient intervention relative to placebo.
Hi, everyone. Good morning. It's Doc M, your champion of well-being, and welcome to another episode of The Edge, the show that looks at well-being, performance, and longevity. Today, I have the honor of speaking with one of the world's experts in micronutrients. She's a co-author of a book of a guest we had a few weeks on the show. And under her recommendation, she suggested that we must have this guest on this show to really deep dive into micronutrients, a subject which has just come up time and time again across the different episodes that we've been filming of this season of The Edge. She is a professor of clinical psychology and the director of mental health and nutrition in New Zealand. Her research looks at the role of nutrition in the expression and treatment of mental health and illness. And then I said she's the author of the book, The Better Brain. Ladies and gentlemen, I welcome you all and welcome Professor Julia Rucklidge to the show. How are you, Professor?
I'm great. Thank you for having me. It's my pleasure to be on The Edge.
Thank you so much. And a question I ask all of my guests, because we're filming this in lockdown and we can literally be anywhere in the world. Where are you in the world today?
Sure. I'm in my office at the University of Canterbury. New Zealand, as you probably know and you're aware of, we do not currently have any community transmission of COVID. And so my life is very normal in that I go to work, I see my students, I teach live. The only downside is that our borders are closed in order to try to keep COVID out of here. So unlike many people, I am not currently in a lockdown per se.
Yeah, it's really been an interesting, shining case study, the way that your country, your government, your leader has sort of led the response to COVID and has allowed the country as a whole to lead a pretty normal life through all of this. And I hope a lot of us can take a lot of learnings from that.
Yeah. I mean, we are fortunate in that it's a small population. And so obviously that means that the spread is going to be easier to contain relative to a really populated environment. You know, I live on a pretty large island and there's more sheep here than there are people. So you can get an idea of that we just have a lot more space. And obviously we're very lucky that we have a moat basically around the country, the islands. And so it's much easier to control the borders and prevent COVID from coming in. And everybody who comes into this country goes into a mandatory managed isolation facility. And that also helps stop COVID from coming into the community. So we obviously do get cases coming in, but they never spread. They very rarely spread to other people.
Yeah. I think the context of today's conversation with COVID and the global lockdown is the challenges that this has had on our mental health and well-being, a subject that we're really going to deep dive in today.
Sure. Yeah.
And for our viewers, the main theme of today's conversation is micronutrients. And a lot of regular viewers of the show will recognize just how often it crops up in the various conversations that we've been having. And therefore, we thought who better to get than one of the world leading experts on this subject. So very grateful for you for your time today. Let's begin by defining. What are micronutrients? For people who are not familiar with this term, what exactly are micronutrients and its role in a biological sense in the body?
Sure. Okay. So the way we define it in the book and think about it generally is that micronutrients represents your minerals and your vitamins and your amino acids. And it's to try to also separate them from our macronutrients, which are your fats, your carbs, and your proteins. And it's really important that the listener appreciates that most of the time when we think about food, we're actually often thinking about it within the context of those macronutrients, making sure that you get a good balance of your fats, carbs, and your proteins. It's all in all of the dietary guidelines that are, shared with the public around how to eat, and that to make sure that you're considering those macronutrients. But what I've discovered over the last few years of really deeply reading food packages is that our focus on the macronutrients has been at the expense of thinking about micronutrients. So people think that as long as they get their macronutrients, then they're going to be okay. And overall, the message of our research has been that no, in fact, you really need to probably be even more concerned and be thinking about your micronutrient content of your food. And the reason why I'm kind of emphasizing this is that at the base of it, macronutrients are contained within your ultra processed foods, but micronutrients are pretty limited in your ultra processed food. So you can kind of see that maybe it's even to the food industry's advantage that they focus on the macronutrients, because we all now know, or at least we should know, that those foods are really depleted in those micronutrients that are essential for brain health. So you asked me about, well, what do these micronutrients do? Micronutrients are absolutely essential for everything that's going on in your whole body. But if we can just specifically focus on brain activity, if you think about making your neurotransmitters, so your dopamine, your serotonin, your adrenaline, GABA, for example, all of those neurotransmitters require enzymes along the pathways to make them, but those enzymes need cofactors, and cofactors are your micronutrients, so your vitamins and minerals. And just for as examples for your audience would be things like your folic acid or your thiamine, your B vitamins, your vitamin C, your D. And some examples of minerals would be your zinc, your magnesium, your iron, your potassium, your phosphorus, your did I say magnesium? I did. Zinc, copper. Those would be examples of your minerals. And so we need all of them. There's no special one. I bet Bonnie said that in her interview, was that there's no magic nutrient, that the brain needs them all in order for those chemical reactions to occur, in order to make, for example, those neurotransmitters, or for example, to make the energy molecules that we need to sustain life. The mitochondria, the powerhouses of our cells, require those micronutrients for every single pathway. So all of those chemical pathways that are happening, they all need these essential nutrients. So I hope that gives the sort of the overall understanding of what the micronutrients are and why they're so essential for brain health, and that we've been overlooking them at the expense of those macronutrients.
I'm reminded of the phrase that Bonnie mentioned on the show, where she was talking about that with most ultra processed foods, the packaging is probably healthier than the content, because at least you're getting your fiber. And anyone watching this particular episode, I really suggest that they sort of rewind back and look at the episode, both with Professor Bonnie Kaplan and with Dr. Robert Lustig as well, because a lot of the themes of today's conversation sort of go hand in glove with one another. You mentioned something really important there, which is it's not just any one. And of course, that's a repetitive theme. And I just want to spend a little time on that, because as clinicians, even now, ordinary members of the public, everyone is always looking for that silver bullet, the one thing that will give me the biggest outcome in life, because we think we live in a world which we're all time starved and we have to be just doing the minimal effective dose of something to get that edge. But you've often spoken about this, and I think you've got both you and Bonnie in the book have got this incredible phrase, the broad spectrum micronutrient, and I just love that, like the analogy to the broad spectrum antibiotic. Can you talk as to why it's important? Why is this interplay between all of these individual micronutrients so fundamental, and how is it that just focusing on one can actually lead to the detriment of another? And I'm just thinking of sort of magnesium and copper, I think, which has got an interesting inverse relationship.
Sure. So First of all, to sort of step backwards and just say, well, first of all, where do we get these nutrients from? Bonnie probably talked about that you get the plant gets the minerals from the soil. That is the only place where you can get those minerals from. And you need that full array of those about 15 minerals that are viewed as essential for human life. And we can't make them. So that's really important. The only place we can get them is out of our food. And then the plant needs that full array, broad spectrum of minerals in order to make a broad spectrum of vitamins. Again, we can't make a lot of vitamins. We can make the bacteria and our microbiome can make a few B vitamins. We can make some, obviously, vitamin D from our skin, from the sun, but that's about it. So we have to eat the plants in order to be able to consume that full array of that about 30 vitamins and minerals, or eat an animal that's eaten the plants so that we can get them that way. And so in terms of why not focusing on one, you said it, is that if you just focus on one, then and you only consume one, then that's very quickly going to be a rate limiting factor in those chemical reactions. Is if you've just got magnesium, but that those particular chemical reactions require zinc as well, or they also need a bit of iron, or they need B6, then if you're just taking that one nutrient, then you can see that it's going to end up being a bottleneck problem in that if you're not consuming all of the other nutrients that are essential for all of those chemical reactions to occur. And as you mentioned, there are some that work together. Zinc and copper work together. And if you take too much zinc without copper, you essentially cause a copper deficiency. And that's what we're trying to avoid. So that's why you take the full array in order to prevent those types of deficiencies from occurring.
Okay, fantastic. And for all the viewers watching, what we'll make sure we do in the show notes is have a full list of what those 30 micronutrients are, so that everyone is well up to date on that. The other sort of question in this theme is around dosing, and if you look at the public literature, the recommended daily allowance, the RDA, and from memory, if I can remember correctly from med school, am I right in thinking that these data points haven't been updated since the 1940s and 50s?
I think there might be a little bit of updating, but overall, I think you'd be about right. Is that it was an attempt to make sure that the troops who went to war would have an adequate amount of nutrients for physical health in order to be able to fight. And that was the bottom line of the determination of the RDA. And it didn't. And so they continued to focus on ensuring that you got a minimum amount to prevent yourself from, first of all, getting a frank nutritional deficiency like scurvy or like rickets, and that there was enough to support, say, bone health or cardiovascular health, but not the brain has not been taken into consideration in the development of RDAs, which is remarkable because the brain is the hungriest organ of the body. It's 2% of body weight, but it consumes between 20 to 40% of the nutrients that we take in. And so really you need to be thinking about your brain when you're consuming your food rather than the rest of the body, because the brain is going to be, it disproportionately takes the nutrients. And so it's interesting that the brain is just not considered when when the dietitians or the ministries of health are coming up with these recommended dietary allowances. So really, really unfortunate, because it also leads the population to think, I can't go, we cannot end up with really black and white thinking. I can't possibly consume anything above an RDA. And I'll tell you right now, if you eat 6 Brazil nuts, you will be consuming more than the RDA of selenium. That doesn't mean you're going to drop dead by taking, consuming 6 Brazil nuts. Of course not. And the same thing would happen if you were to eat, say, a cup of kale. You'd get more B vitamins in there than your 100% RDA. So I really want to dispel that myth that you should be focusing on that 100% and trying very hard not to go above it. I would say if you're eating a full array of plants, of your vitamins, of your vegetables and your fruit, you will be going over RDA. But nobody's telling us to stop eating our vegetables and fruit. So, but if you are consuming a diet that's mostly ultra processed, then you'll be lucky to hit 100%. Yeah. In terms of those nutrients. And that's because of the ultra processing strips those micronutrients out of the food, and they might put a few back in. They might put a bit of iron back in, or they might put a bit of folate back in, but they are certainly not going to put the full array of those 30 vitamins and minerals. And I ask you, if somebody if somebody wants to get their vitamins and minerals tested, for example, do they ever test for your molybdenum levels? Is that tested?
Absolutely not. Yeah.
We might test zinc, you might test your vitamin D, you might test a few of those 30, but there is, I show me someone who regularly tests the full 30, and yet that is the approach that's taken to determine whether or not someone has a nutritional deficiency, and they're not even testing the full array of the 30. So there are some challenges to the way we, things are conducted at the moment in serum levels. And I would even say, based on the research that I've been involved in looking at serum levels, I don't think they're a good indicator for deficiency at all. I think it would definitely pick up a really serious deficiency. You'd pick up on whether or not someone was really deficient in, say, vitamin D. But based on our research, we've been able to show that even people who come in with normal levels of nutrients, they can still benefit from additional nutrients. And so that challenges this idea that if your levels are normal, then you don't need anything more. So the levels are comparing your levels to the average individual as opposed to what my nutritional needs are. And they could be compromised because of genetics or, differences in terms of my ability to metabolize certain nutrients. That's going to influence my overall needs. And also where I am in life, if I'm taking medications, if I'm stressed, if I'm pregnant, if I'm, going through a growth spurt, that's going to influence my nutritional needs. And that's not taken into consideration when you do serum levels.
Yeah, absolutely.
I went off on a tangent there, but
no, it's so relevant, because I'll just share, N=1 here, just anecdotal of what I've been experimenting with in the last year. I had COVID almost this time last year, and I had a relatively tough time, so I was sort of measuring my way out of it. And what I noticed was that immediately after it, I started taking vitamin B shots, because during the acute illness, my vitamin B levels went down, like any sort of viral illness and chronic disease. And whilst my B levels came up nice and high, and it was actually at the upper range of normal, when I tested my homocysteine levels were really high. And I had a conversation with my endocrinologist, and he suggested that, for me, for where I am with my disease and my recovery, then even though I'm sitting at the upper level of normal for B complex, because of homocysteine is still showing such an elevated level, that actually I need to have more. My body is still craving more vitamin D to bring it down. And the same with vitamin D. I'm a long distance runner. I run every day outside in a little vest, thinking I'm getting lots of sunshine. I have lots of nuts and I have a very clean diet. But when I tested my vitamin D, it was in my boots. It was really, really low. And I then did a genetic test, and I discovered that I have an MTHFR, if I'm saying it correctly. I don't metabolize vitamin D properly. And so now I've gone on to daily vitamin D supplements as well. So it just shows to anyone watching that it's really relative. It's your resiliency. It's what you've gone through. It's what your requirements are. And the best way of knowing it, you can't treat it if you don't test it. So, if you've got access, measure it. If you can't measure it, then look at what you're taking and go to resources like this and look at Dr. Julia's work to try and ensure that you're getting the right micronutrients for performance and your health as well.
Yeah. Exactly. Yeah. And, while the testing, like as you've described, was useful in terms of the direction, My worry about the testing, because I've seen it over and over and over again, and I get emails about this all the time. I'll get somebody contacting me saying, well, my doctor did my nutrient levels and they're all normal. So they've told me it would be a waste of my time to try the micronutrients. What do I think? And I would say, well, actually, the majority of people who we test in our research studies are normal in their nutrient levels, and yet we show they benefit from the nutrient intervention relative to placebo. And so that to me says that testing is really limited. And so it's great for identifying a deficiency, but we just need to be really careful because we miss the opportunity of treating people who are technically normal and yet they benefit from this intervention. And so I worry about those people who might get overlooked as a consequence of focusing too much on the testing and using that as a reason to make a decision about whether or not to use the micronutrients or not.
Yeah. And from a practical terms, and one of the things that I respect so much about your work is the independence that you have from any sort of vested interests and sponsors. So we were not going to talk about any brands, any particular sort of interventions, but folks are often asked this question when it comes to sort of improving their micronutrients. They say, well, doc, I'm eating a clean diet, plant-based, maybe some fish, a little bit of lean meat. I'm getting a nice broad spectrum. Do I really need to have a supplement to enhance my micronutrient? Now, I've always been of the view, and I went through this with Bonnie, that the quality of our soil, and we were looking at some of the Canadian studies together with regard to deficiencies in magnesium and calcium and copper, etc., and how the soil quality has depressed, and therefore the plant doesn't have the right sort of supplement to allow it to grow, and therefore it can't give it to us. What are your views on diet versus supplementation? And if one were to supplement, is there a particular type? Like, is it a multivitamin or is it the individual supplements to be taken at the RDAs that you were suggesting?
Right. Okay. So I guess I take a pretty practical approach on this. If you are someone who is healthy, you are mentally and physically well, there's no evidence of any disease, then do you need to supplement? I think some people would be perfectly fine not supplementing. Some might decide that they want to supplement as kind of like an insurance purpose, like, just to protect them over time or in the future. But those people are not the ones who we tend to see because they're well and they're doing fine. And I just certainly don't think that we necessarily have to supplement the whole population. So I guess those individuals can make their own decision about whether or not they want to do the supplementing in order to maybe prevent themselves being ill in the future. But overall, if you're healthy, I'd say, well, it sounds like you've got a lot of things going. You're obviously doing a lot of things right. So, and they might be one of these really amazingly resilient individuals who have remarkable genetics that mean that they're amazing metabolizers of the nutrients, and that they're really efficient in terms of the foods that they do eat and what they are able to get out of their foods. So, I would say that type of person is probably fairly rare, because we all experience stress. We all have things that are going on that really overconsume nutrients. And so we may need to support ourselves with more. So, but the first thing that it would definitely be, you've got to clean up your diet. That's the first thing, is that ultra processed foods are doing nothing for us. There's not a single study out there that has shown that this has been good for our mental or physical health. So, I certainly have never read a headline, and do correct me if I'm wrong, that says things like, that ultra processed food improves your cognitive functioning, or it makes you happy, or it reduces your anxiety. There isn't a single study out there that is showing that. And so there's got to be a point where we go, wow, well, that was a really bad mistake that we thought that it was okay to eat these foods and it would provide us with the full array of nutrients that our bodies and our brains need. And I understand why it happened. If you think of, you think about the opportunities that it provided to, say, women to go to work because they didn't have to cook, and, it afforded a lot of flexibility in people's lives. But the downside is that eating that has made us us a sicker generation than ever. And we are, we've gotten fatter, we're sicker, we've got an epidemic of mental health problems, we've got more diabetes. Everything has gone in the wrong direction when we started to eat and consume ultra processed food. So first thing is cut out the crap. So I put it simply, and starting increasing your intake of your real whole foods. What is the real whole foods? It's what your grandmother or your great grandmother would recognize as being food. It's not things that have got a whole list of ingredients on the backs of packages. Okay, so I feel like I only answered part of your question there.
The other part was if someone was going to supplement, should they do
yes.
Yeah.
Yes. Okay. So because there's been such a focus on RDA, that has influenced a lot of the laws around supplements. Now, I don't know how it is where you are, but in New Zealand and in other in Europe or in North America, that's meant that the supplements that are sold in supermarkets are often way below RDA. So they do focus on RDA, and you'll look at the back and they'll say the percentage of RDA in our food is considered very similarly. And so that means, and there's also some legislation that prevents them from going too high. And I think that there's a lot of politics involved in that, because as the higher you go, the more therapeutic it becomes. You take things at really low doses, it will, as I said earlier, it might prevent you from getting a frank nutritional deficiency. It might prevent you from getting scurvy, rickets, those kind of big physical ailments, but it does not give you the nutrients at the doses for optimal brain health. That's where the research that I've been involved in is really showing that in some cases, people need to go above that RDA in order to be able to experience better mental health. So, I kind of think about that. It's not entirely fair, but you might think about your supermarket brand as being similar to your ultra processed food, in that the nutrients that are provided in your supermarket brand are pretty similar to your ultra processed food. And what we know about that is that it's nutrient depleted, and it hasn't done it in terms of improving our health. And so thinking about your real food, I was saying earlier, you're going above RDA. So it might be that in order to achieve better mental health, you really need to go above RDA. And that's what our research has shown. But it's not people often, as I said, they're kind of so focused on that number that they get worried that they're going to get sick or it's going to be toxic if they go above RDA. And we've collected so much data on safety, looking at, liver functioning, kidney functioning, short-term, long-term side effects, compared side effects placebo to active. So we've really tried to do justice to trying to understand whether or not there is any concern. Is there any kind of flag that's coming up repeatedly that we should really be aware of? And at this point in time, there hasn't been. There is research out there that does take that single nutrient approach. And that's when we see the problems. Like, for example, I've seen studies that show that if you take folic acid on its own, for some people that increases the chances of prostate cancer. But those studies have been done just looking at that one nutrient consumed on its own. So we can't extend and extrapolate that research to the broad spectrum approach, because the broad spectrum approach obviously is giving the full array of nutrients that folic acid works alongside. So do we have the same level of risk with the broad spectrum approach? The answer is, I don't know. But it would seem to me less likely that you would have that problem, because you're consuming it in the full array that our body has evolved to manage those nutrients. So the body didn't evolve to take in just one nutrient. So it doesn't, to me, it doesn't actually make any sense anymore to me. I used to kind of go, yeah, of course, why wouldn't you just take one single nutrient? Because that scientists have been kind of bred to believe that the only way to solve any really difficult, complex issues is with one molecule, right? Like Prozac or Ritalin, but whereas what we now know is that actually that approach, well, first of all, is limited, hasn't helped enough people. Otherwise, we wouldn't have a mental health crisis. But also that it's not being true to our physiology that I was talking about earlier around the chemical reactions requiring the full array of your nutrients. So I hope I answered your question about whether or not you should go out. I mean, I would go with the broad spectrum. I appreciate it sort of really does sort of challenge our worldview because we're always looking for that magic. But I always wonder when people say they just take one thing, I'm like, why are you taking the full array? But that might be my bias.
No, absolutely. That's great advice. Now, before we get into the conversation around the role of micronutrients in mitigating, preventing, and treating mental health, I want to just ask a little bit about the digestion of this, because it's an amazing statistic that we went into with Dr. Emran Mayer last week, which is where we're just 1% human. 99% of us are microbial, microbiome DNA and cells which sit inside of our gut primarily. And so we can be consuming all of these incredible micronutrients, but if we don't have the right flora, the right environment to absorb it, very little can be done. Talk to us a little bit about the importance of microbiome and how it's fundamental to some of the work that you were talking around micronutrients and the absorption of these.
Sure. I'll do my best, although he really is your expert. So, he knows way more than I do about the microbiome. But I'll talk specifically about some research that I've done on the microbiome, and that provides a little bit of insight into where how the micronutrient interventions might be relevant. I mean, one of the things that I have talked a little bit about why we think the micronutrients are important, and I talked about that in terms of brain chemistry. But another thing that we've discovered based on taking microbiome samples from our participants, and so that's getting a stool sample before and after exposure to the micronutrients, is that we did a small study. And this, your audience needs to understand this is a small study we need to replicate. But it was really, really intriguing. And that is that when we gave these children with ADHD micronutrients, and we looked at their microbiome relative to kids who took the placebo, the change that was noted was in bacterial diversity. And I expect that's something that you might have talked to a little bit with Emran around. It's that, yes, we're in these early stages of understanding which bacteria are important and which aren't. But what is probably important is similar to the broad spectrum of micronutrients is a broad spectrum of bacteria. Is that we are not going to thrive with one bacteria in our microbiome. And in fact, we know that people who have a less diverse microbiome don't seem to do as well. They seem to be more prone to illness, whether or not that's physical illness or mental illness. And so there's these interesting correlations that are being discovered. And then you throw in the fact that when we gave people more micronutrients, that seemed to have a positive effect on that diversity. That to me seems like overall, hopefully a good thing. But we do need to better understand that because we're in such early days of understanding this. But if you think about some of the places that we're going to treat mental health issues, I don't know if you talked about the transplants, the fecal transplants. Well, fecal transplants are not just giving one bacteria, they're giving the full array, taking someone who is really healthy, taking their microbiome, transplanting that into someone else, whether that's in a form of a capsule or some other way of inserting it. and finding some really interesting positive benefits for people's mental health. So that's, again, speaking to probably no magic bacteria. It's the diversity that's possibly going to be important, and the fact that one of the mechanisms that might help us explain why the micronutrients were benefiting the kids with ADHD, one of those routes might actually be through the effects that it had on the bacterial environment.
Okay. All right, let's dive deeply then into mental health and how micronutrients are important. And I think there are two big conversations that we can have in this section. One is the stress and anxiety side of the equation,
Sure.
and the other is sort of the depression and low mood. And I think both of those have been so attenuated by what's been going on in the world right now. But let's look at stress. What I was most fascinated with your research is that in this microcosm of where you're operating, such stressful events have happened to that population over the last few years. And I think back to, I think it was the 2010 earthquake, was it?
Mm-hmm.
Then you had the big floods, and then the horrendous attack in the mosque a few years ago. And all through this, you had research going on, looking at the role of micronutrients and stress levels and the interplay between that. Can you tell us about the study, how it started, and then sort of how it sort of evolved through the years and what you've been finding along the way?
Yeah, exactly. I mean, it's my favorite work. It's what I like to talk about the most is our research that's been on. At the end of the day, it's about resilience, and that's sort of the conclusion I've come to. So when our first earthquake, and my first big earthquake was September 2010, and it was a massive earthquake just outside of Christchurch in a place called Darfield. Huge earthquake, I think it was 7.1. It was in the middle of the night. Absolutely terrifying. But the positive thing about that earthquake was that no one died. No one died in it. There was some damage. It was, but remarkably minor relative to what could have happened. But afterwards, the roads were cracked. The university was closed. My house was not badly damaged, which was really fortunate. And it got me thinking. It got me thinking, going, you know what? I remember when I was a graduate student that there was some research on people after a California earthquake, looking at the effects of it was a pain management course on arthritis. And I immediately, I was like, I remember as a graduate student thinking, wow, that's really cool that they did that, that they took this event, this natural event, and turned it into a national experiment. So I thought to myself, well, what can I do? What can I look at? And and it was obviously we could look at the effects of whether or not you were consuming micronutrients at the time of that earthquake or not. And that was just based on where you were in one of my studies. So we had lots of different studies that were going on at that time. We had people who were on them, who were off them, who'd stopped. And so we contacted everyone who had been in our studies or was currently in our studies. And interestingly, I mean, it wasn't deliberate, but we had about half of them had been taking the micronutrients, the broad spectrum of micronutrients, and about half of them weren't. And so we could compare we called them up, we administered over the phone some measures of stress, anxiety, and depression. And we did that over a 3-week period. So we phoned them, 1 week, 2 week, 3 weeks. And we knew what they'd been like beforehand, before the earthquake, because they'd been in one of our research studies. So we had a sort of an idea of a baseline idea impression of their stress, anxiety, and depression. And what we found was that, yes, people get stressed after an earthquake. That is not surprising. But that over time, the people who had been taking the micronutrients, who happened to be taking the micronutrients at that time, were more likely to have a sharper decline and improvement in their stress and improvement in their anxiety and their depression than people who happen to not be taking the micronutrients. And so to me, that says a lot about resilience. It says a lot about how nutrients provide the brain with the nutrients that it needs for the fight-flight response. So just like I was saying before, you need nutrients to make dopamine or serotonin. You also need the nutrients to make your adrenaline, which is part of your fight-flight response. And so the way I thought about it was that if you're well nourished before an event like an earthquake, then your fight-flight response needs nutrients, but there's nutrients that are left over for regulation of your mood, regulation of your sleep, regulation of your anxiety. So the people who had been taking the micronutrients as part of the research were in a far better position to be more resilient to the stress associated with that earthquake relative to people who were, you could call them, more poorly nourished. And so they just had less reserves left over. So it really speaks to the bigger context of any kind of stressor, like COVID, for example, or the following studies that we did following the mosque shooting, et cetera, is that we need to be able to ensure that not only is the fight-flight response supported with nutrients, but that you're consuming enough in your diet that you also support all of the other functions that kind of get put on hold. It's like a triage system, is that if you're in the hospital and you're just been in a major motor vehicle accident, you're going to be seen before the person who's got the sprained ankle. Same thing happens in our body. It triages. So that's, I explain that study particularly because it really does speak to that resilience. But then after the February 2011 earthquake, we had a chance to look at whether or not, if you give people nutrients after the event, can we help people in terms of their likelihood of having PTSD symptoms? And the answer is yes, you can. So we reduced the rates of probable PTSD from 65% down to 19% with just a 1-month intervention with micronutrients, with no change in people who went into the treatment as usual.
Sorry, you said probable. Yeah, explain what that means. Yeah.
It just means that we assessed PTSD with a questionnaire. And so we didn't go through it like a clinical interview. So I call it probable PTSD because I don't want to call it PTSD because we didn't do the full clinician interview to assess for PTSD. We just couldn't in that environment. I mean, it was a far more devastating earthquake. 185 people died in that earthquake. The city was destroyed. We were working in really remote conditions, really difficult conditions after that earthquake. But it's still, we still found that, what was interesting was that, okay, you're best to take your nutrients before you're in a natural, natural disaster. But even if you take it afterwards, we can still help your brain overcome the stress associated with that event. And then we replicated that after a flood. The flood was actually in Canada, in Alberta, Canada, where Bonnie is. And we found the same thing, giving people a B complex or a broad spectrum of nutrients. It reduced their stress down into the normal non-clinical range. And that didn't happen in the comparator group, which was a vitamin D comparator group. And then after the devastating, awful mass shooting in 2 mosques in Christchurch in March 15th, 2019, we gave nutrients to the survivors. And we saw that we replicated the same thing, which was just giving people additional nutrients at a time of great stress seems to support that resilience that I'm talking about. So, and the body doesn't kind of distinguish between the stressors. It's, whether it's a flood or whether or not it's financial stress or an earthquake or COVID, your body is going to respond very similarly. I was in the UK a few months ago because my father passed away, and I went over for his funeral. I actually hoped to see him, but I didn't make it. But going from a environment like we were talking about at the beginning was that we have no COVID in New Zealand, and then to go to an environment where obviously there's COVID in the community in the United Kingdom, I felt, so I can really describe this really clearly, is that I felt that anxiety just like I did after the earthquakes. I was feeling that same kind of hypervigilance, awareness of the environment, the anxiety associated with what was happening in that environment. And yet the stressor was completely different. And so I just use that as one case example, but I know that people will often describe the feeling is very similar. It doesn't matter what the stressor is. But I'd certainly say that people who are better nourished are going to hopefully have just respond more positively to the ongoing stress associated with COVID or any other sort of overall stressor. So I hope that describes those studies to you.
Yeah. No, that's great. And there's so many sort of ideas that we're going through. I mean, one of the things that I've been very fascinated in looking at is anatomical and structural changes because of chronic stress, particularly in certain parts of the brain, like the limbic system, the amygdala, parts of the hippocampi, etc. And certainly, a chronic long-term stressful event causes changes in that, and it makes sense with what you're saying. If there's nutrient sort of flowing to other parts of the brain, then you would expect for areas involved in these sort of, let's say, non-acute stressful responses to be fed less, and therefore these anatomical changes can be seen. What was interesting when you were talking as well is when you were comparing different stressful events. I wondered, in the studies, did you have an arm which was just sort of pure CBT or some sort of psychological intervention, and compare that with and the intervention being the micronutrient, or was it the gold standard plus the micronutrient? How were the studies structured?
Right. I mean, that's a great question and a great way to maybe do our next study after an event. But what we did with the nutrients is that we allowed people to have counseling if that's what they wanted to. We didn't stop them from seeking out social support or anything like that. The one thing, though, was that they couldn't take medications. And so medications were excluded for people who take the micronutrients. And that's the case for all of the studies that I have done in New Zealand. And the reason for that is that the clinical observations of psychiatrists who use the broad spectrum of nutrients at the doses that we're giving them, which is, as we've talked about, are higher than your typical supermarket kind of one a day vitamin pill, that when you get into those levels, what they observe is that there's an interaction that happens with the medications. And whether or not it's an interaction, or whether or not by providing the nutrients, you get the brain to a healthier state, so it no longer needs the medications. Not quite sure what's going on there. Does it influence the way the liver metabolizes the medication? Does it change that? Kind of like in a way like grapefruit, we know affects the metabolism of some medications. Is that happening? Is it that by providing the cofactors, you're supporting the serotonergic system, and so then you throw in an SSRI into that mix? Does that influence have an effect on the amount of medication that you need? We don't know yet, but what we do know is that the medications do need to be adjusted based on clinical observations from psychiatrists who have used this. And it's also, Bonnie and I have both published on this as well. People do better with the nutrients when the dose of the medication is gradually reduced. So it does need to be done under good supervision with the prescriber. So that means that we just exclude people who are on medication, which is unfortunate, because we're excluding then about 17% of the adult population in New Zealand is taking an antidepressant. So and I'm sure those numbers are very similar around the world. So it does mean that our data are going to be, it's harder to say whether or not it's going to be relevant to people who are medicated. And that is something we want to address, but it's very hard to address in these kind of controlled conditions. But we did compare in the earthquake study, the one after February 2011, we had a treatment as usual group, and they were people who decided they didn't want to take the micronutrients, but they were happy to be monitored. And they were doing a mix of things. Some of them were going for counseling. Some of them decided they'd prefer to go for medications. And some of them decided they didn't want to do anything at all. And we monitored them as well. And that group didn't change in the span of the study, which was 4 to 6 weeks. Whereas the people who were in the micronutrient interventions did show the great change that I described earlier. So we can't say at this stage, is it the same as psychotherapy? Is it better than psychotherapy? Does it augment psychotherapy? Those are all still unknown questions. But I intuitively, I think you'd be more likely to be able to engage in psychotherapy if your brain is well nourished. It kind of sort of intuitively makes sense, but it's still an empirical question that needs to be answered.
Yeah. So a metabolic tune-up to sort of get the body going in the right direction. Okay, last section, something I really wanted to talk about. And, I was joking with you before we started that, I would love to be a student in your lectures, this badass scientist who's sort of taking on the world in many ways. And it comes fundamentally to even what you were just describing, which is the role of pharmacological agents in treatment of mental health and how we've gotten to this stage historically. Now, a lot of your work is sort of looking at the problems with bad science, the challenges that big pharma has across the medical education and continued medical education thereafter post graduation. And I know even your TEDx talk, which is almost 2 million views now. I think it was 1.8 million the last time I checked. Has even though it's been red flagged, after being red flagged, the number of viewers has more than doubled. So clearly it's tapping into an energy which people are very frustrated about. How are you structuring your work around this, and what are the biggest challenges that you face? Because you're really going hard at it, right? You're challenging the status quo. You go to a psychiatrist and you say, stop prescribing that Ritalin, instead give this cocktail of micronutrients. I can kind of guess what the conversation is going to be in that office. Right. So how do you go about
it? How do I go about it? I mean, I go back to something that I said, I think I said in my TEDx talk, which is that I learned about the nutrients from Bonnie at a time when I had been taught that nutrients were irrelevant to the brain. And so my education was very similar to a medical practitioner education or a psychiatrist, which is that why would you care about nutrition? As long as you eat a good diet, and no one ever defines what a good diet is, and presumably that means could be full of ultra processed foods, as long as you're getting your macronutrients right, that you should be fine and you don't need to worry about that. And the number of times I've heard that over the years, that those micronutrients can't possibly be necessary over a good diet, then I would just say, okay, well, that's an empirical question. That is something that you can ask with a scientific study. And so that's why I thought, well, I hear about these families in Southern Alberta, Canada, who claim that they can treat really serious problems with these micronutrients. Let's put it to this test, because at the end of the day, why did I go into psychology? Why did I become a clinical psychologist? I went into clinical psychology very similarly to why people go into medicine, which is that you ultimately want people to get better. And it wasn't soon after I graduated that the naivety went, I became a little bit more tuned into what was actually happening, and that not enough people are getting well with these conventional treatments. Not enough people are getting well with psychotherapy, the best psychotherapy. And I've witnessed it. And I know many of my clinician colleagues have witnessed it. And I've seen it with medications. It's not that medications don't help some people. Of course they do. Yes, they do. Yeah, but not enough of them are getting well. And unfortunately, too many of them struggle to come off of them. And that's become really well acknowledged over the last few years as the challenges of withdrawal. So we should all be in agreement that we want to have the best for our patients. But unfortunately, we end up with these allegiances to our profession or to our education, and that we get blindsided and we think that that's the only way to look at the world, and that we can't look at the world in any other way. And I guess I got to, as a scientist, I think, yeah, I get where that comes from. But ultimately, I am the critic and conscience of society. That's my role. That's my job. That's why I've ended up in the university. And so if I just go with the status quo, we will never change. We will never evolve. We will never come up with new ways of thinking about the world. And so that's all I did. That's all I did was to go, that's a really unusual idea. Those micronutrients, that doesn't fit with my worldview. But let's face it, we're not doing a good enough job for people. So it's my duty to study it. And I might find out they don't work. that's fine. No allegiance. I don't, as you said earlier, I don't work for the companies that make the nutrients that I've studied. I don't make any money out of it. I'm not funded by them. But I might, if I discover they don't work, well, I'm sure a lot of people would be really excited about it. And I would have made it into the American Journal of Psychiatry by now if I found they didn't work. But instead, we found that they did confer some positive benefits for some, not all people, but certainly a substantial number of people have benefited. And so when I first, discovered this using double-blinded placebo-controlled trials, I thought so many people would be thrilled. I just thought this was going to, splash around the world. I was just so naive. And instead, I couldn't publish it. I was rejected so many times by journals who just said, this isn't of interest to our readers. And you're like, but I've just shown that nutrients help people with, our first study was with adults with ADHD. Why don't you think your readers would care about this? This is important work. So it took a lot of battles to finally get it published. I did get it published in the British Journal of Psychiatry, the first one, with an appeal of their first decision. They first rejected it. And I went back and I said, well, that's interesting that you said X, Y, and Z. Here's a very, a very good reasons why you're wrong. And so they did go back and they re-reviewed it and they decided to publish it. So, but it's been really just it's been an amazingly hard road that I wouldn't have expected. I wouldn't have expected the number of grant rejections, the challenges I've had with ethics committees where they think that these are dangerous micronutrients. All of it's been hard. And then the TED flag was heartbreaking. It was just devastating when that happened, because I was like, I tick all their, I've done the studies they expect. I work for a university. This is peer reviewed. Tick all the boxes, and yet they flagged it as being, as problematic. And in the end, the only thing they could criticize me for, because the flag got changed over time because they were actually incorrect in their first flag. It was wrong. But they wanted to keep it, and they were clearly influenced by someone, who knows what. But it now says that I oversimplify. It doesn't meet their guidelines because I oversimplify legitimate studies. Who doesn't oversimplify in an 18-minute talk? But anyway, and as you say, it's actually increased the views. People are like, why did TED do that? Why did that happen? And there's got to be there's something sinister behind it, but they would never tell me. They wouldn't tell me who complained, why it happened. And there are thousands and thousands of talks out there that don't meet their criteria, that have not been flagged. So clearly it was bugging someone, and it was clearly getting too much attention. I don't know. Or they did it, it was a kind of like some weird thing where they actually wanted it to get watched more. I don't know.
I hope that's the case. But look, we all celebrate your work. We support what you're doing. I remember my first day as a doctor in the ICU. My consultant came to me and said, "Marcus, three words of advice: trust no one, question everything, and give oxygen." And 20 days, I have not forgotten that. So I think the world needs more antagonists to get the right science.
I think we do, and I worry about where we're at right now. There's a lot of black and white. You're either pro or you're anti, and science is gray. As I said earlier, I'm not anti-med, and I'm, I see the role. It plays a role. I understand why physicians are skeptical of this. I get their the medical training. This doesn't fit into that worldview. But all I ask of everybody is to be open and to be curious, about the data, to be curious. And then in the end, when you think about it, you kind of go, of course it makes sense to give micronutrients, because it's proof of principle that our food supply has been so eroded over the last 100 years. No wonder we are starving. And I like to call it hidden brain hunger, because that's what's happened. Our brains are now being depleted of the essential nutrients that it needs to operate. It's as simple as that. And that's what our research proved.
Fabulous. That's an incredibly powerful point to end this conversation on. Dr. Julia Rucklidge, thank you so much for your time with me this morning. I really enjoyed it. I'm so glad that Bonnie suggested that we do this and we go even deeper into the conversation of micronutrients. So thank you for being with us on The Human Edge.
Thank you. My pleasure.
Thank you.